All right, let's bring in Perrin Beatty now. He's the former president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, also a former foreign minister, of Foreign Affairs, and a former Minister of National Defense. He joins us from Naples, Florida. Perrin, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Glad to be with you. Your
immediate reaction here. We know that Donald Trump talked about putting America first, talked about ensuring that American jobs would be safe and it was American products in America. But now we're seeing a potential 25% on Canadian goods.
Well, it's obviously of major concern to the Canadian business community and should be to the Canadian government. But we shouldn't panic. I hope the government will be measured in any response that it makes. Most importantly, we need to have a strategy. It's abundantly clear that the incoming president intends to move very aggressively on a number of different fronts very quickly. And there are things that our government should be doing. The first is that we should be avoiding doing things that make the matters worse. An example of that was the digital services tax that the Americans had warned us about, but we went ahead and did it anyway and felt there wouldn't be repercussions from that. Our politicians need to avoid chest thumping and try to play the Trump card as to try to gain advantage in the Canadian election, which will be coming up. That could be the very worst thing to be done, and the assumption that nobody on the U.S. side of the border is listening. We need to address very seriously the issues that are of concern to the Americans. You were talking earlier about what was done last time, where there was a charm offensive, and I was part of that, going out in the Southeast, meeting particularly with Republican legislators and others to talk about the importance of the bilateral relationship. I led a mission down to Washington earlier this year on behalf of the Canadian Chamber, and the American business community were very blunt, very direct with us. They said, the charm offensive will not work unless you address some of the underlying concerns that we have, such as the digital services tax. Another one is anything related to security. You saw it during the election campaign, that before you could talk about anything else, the Americans want to deal with this question of security. We need to address this both in terms of our own borders and in terms of the contribution that we make to defense as well. Taking these sorts of measures can be helpful, and we should not wait until Inauguration Day to do it.
In the past, during his last time as president, we saw a bit of a tit for tat coming back and forth here, where Donald Trump talked about taxing again on Canadian goods, and we came back with taxing on steel. Could we see some of that, a bit pushback on Canada's part to say, well, we're not going to take on, we won't let the bully us?
I certainly don't think that now is the time to get into some sort of a spitting contest across the border. Mr. Trump hasn't even been inaugurated yet. He won't be until the 20th of January. But what we need to do is to in a very rational way, have a clear plan, mobilize the Canadian business community, Canadian premiers, Canadian mayors, and others to reach out across the border. We need to address the issues that are fundamentally important to the Americans. And we need to recognize that it's not going to be business as usual. That we have a president who, instead of seeing this as being the special relationship between Canada and the United States, sees the relationship much more on a transactional basis. And we're also moving both in this bilateral relationship and into international relations more generally, away from the principle of the rule of law to the principle of the rule of power, that he who holds all of the cards is going to play them and use them to advantage. That's a very different environment from the one in which we've operated for the last several decades.
We've been getting reaction, Perrin. I want to show this tweet coming in from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. If we can show this one to our viewers right now with regards to his reaction, saying that Justin Trudeau, you cannot keep your head in the sand, stand up and fight. And this is Jagmeet Singh's words here, fight like hell. Canadian jobs are on the line here. So let's talk about the job front here, because I'm sure many businesses.
Well, let's talk about the tweet first for a minute.
Yes.
I can't think of a worse response than to start a spinning contest across the 49th parallel. What he has done is to take the bait even before Donald Trump has been sworn in. What we don't need is to escalate things. What we need to do is to have a strategy and a rational dialogue and to keep cool heads. Setting our hair on fire is not going to help anyone.
I know that the premiers want to have conversations with the Prime Minister as well. In general, there was the letter that was signed by Doug Ford on behalf of all the premiers saying we need to have a sit down. We need to talk about what this relationship is going to look like. What do you anticipate now the conversations are going to be now that we're dealing with this?
Well, I think that sort of a discussion is critical. Mm-hmm. In many ways, the premiers can be more helpful than any federal politician can be at this point. They have relationship with governors on the other side of the border. Canadian mayors have relationships with their counterparts on the other side of the border. The members of the Canadian business community have similar relationships. And what we need to be doing is reaching out, cultivating those relationships, stressing the importance of them to both the U.S. and to Canada, and having a coordinated, coherent strategy. What we don't need is ex cathedra statements from federal politicians looking to gain domestic political advantage.
We've been getting some reaction, continued reaction. And speaking of Doug Ford, he has now tweeted out in response to this, Perrin. I'm going to read this to you and get your thoughts here. So Doug Ford saying this on X, a 25% tariff would be devastating to workers and jobs in both Canada and the United States. The federal government needs to take the situation at our border seriously. We need a Team Canada approach and response, and we need it now. Prime Minister Trudeau must call an urgent meeting with all premiers. So we're now hearing, of course, the alarm bells are sounding here. Concern, of course, about jobs. But, and I spoke with Colin about this as well, the border, and you've mentioned this too, appears to be sort of one of those immediate critical factors Donald Trump is certainly listening to see what Canada's response is going to be.
Absolutely. Ironically, I tweeted last night on this and said, we have to recognize that this is going to be a top priority for the new U.S. administration. And we need to demonstrate that we are taking security at our border very seriously before the inauguration, not waiting until then. And Premier Ford's tweet is very much in line with that. Mm-hmm. And we need to have a coherent, shared approach with everybody pulling on the oars in the same direction. But what we don't need is people panicking or making silly, chest-beating statements that simply inflame the situation.
What do you think this is going to do to Canadian trade, to businesses, when we were talking about the supply chain?
Well, I think the important thing is that we need to ensure that this doesn't happen. We shouldn't take it as a given that this is going to happen. The president-elect has signaled that barring something happening, that he's prepared to act very quickly on this. We should take that very seriously, but we should be addressing now, between now and January 20th, the genuine concerns. And we should be doing it not simply to appease the Americans, but to satisfy ourselves that our own borders are secure, and that we are doing what we can to ensure that this most important trading relationship in the world is maintained to the benefit of both countries.
What about the diplomacy side? Donald Trump has been categorized as now someone who is not good on the diplomacy side. But as you say here, not that we have to tread carefully, but we have to tread smart. So your take here on the diplomacy side of things?
Well, I think the important thing, we have, in terms of diplomacy, we have a top-notch team in Washington and at the consulates across the country, across the U.S., but they can't do it alone. And what they need is for Team Canada literally to be mobilized, not simply for cabinet ministers or the prime minister to go and make speeches or have meetings in the U.S., but literally a mobilization in Canada of people reaching out and talking about the importance of this relationship. But before any of that can be successful, we have to demonstrate to the Americans for whom security is the number one issue that we take it just as seriously as they do. Mm-hmm. Unless we can, that's the key to unlocking any other discussion.
Yeah.
For us, the key issue is the trading relationship, the bilateral commercial relationship. For them, it's security. You will not get to the discussion about trade unless you can unlock the security issue first.
And Donald Trump has certainly made that very, very clear, especially talking about the borders and what it means, of course, focusing on the U.S. But as you point out, Canada's got to focus on what it's going to mean here in Canada, especially when he talks about his massive migration. Perrin, it is great to have you and get your analysis on this. Really appreciate this. Perrin Beatty speaking to us.
My pleasure.
You're welcome.